All right, so you're going to begin on this side. You're not going to begin on the reading side. You're going to begin on this side with the questions, right? And the first question is a multiple select with the little square thing, right? Which means there is there is more than one possible answer, and actually there probably is more than one possible answer. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna play the the podcast first because that's gonna really help you along. Now, what is the question? The question is which statements about female indentured servants in the colonies are correct? Indentured women received a dowry in exchange for their work. Female indentured servants typically worked as domestic servants. About 1/3 of the indentured servants in the Chesapeake were women. A female indentured servant was expected to marry when her term of service ended, or indentured women's future prospects were worse than men. But before we get into any of that, right, we're going to go over here and we're just going to play a little bit to see if we can get an idea, right, of from the podcasts, right, on how to answer this. Oh, here we go.
All right, so we're diving deep into colonial America today, and we've got some great sources to guide us. A textbook chapter that kind of lays the groundwork.
That one right there is chapter 3, right?
Yeah.
For society and culture. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, okay. And those are the questions we're doing, chapter 3.
First-hand account that'll really bring things to life. Get ready for some serious aha moments, I think. So, to kick things off, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered who was really in charge along the Atlantic coast by the late 1600s?
Ooh, that's a good one. Most people probably assume it was still the Native American population.
Right, because that's what we usually learn in school.
Yeah.
But the reality is, things had shifted dramatically in just a few generations. By the late 1600s, Europeans and Africans actually outnumbered Native Americans along the Atlantic coast.
It's a pretty mind-blowing fact when you think about it.
It is. I mean, that's a huge GE change. So what happened? What led to such a dramatic shift in the population?
Well, there were three main factors at play. You had immigration, of course, tons of people coming over from Europe seeking new opportunities.
Right, that makes sense. America as the land of opportunity, even back then.
Exactly. And then, unfortunately, you had the forced migration of enslaved Africans, which, as we know, is a dark and tragic chapter in our history.
Absolutely. We can't shy away from that.
And then the third factor was natural increase.
Natural increase.
Yeah, basically it just means more people were being born than were dying.
Oh, right. Families grow. Yeah, these were small landowners.
Okay, so apparently in the podcast, it doesn't say anything about that. Okay, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, but at least we already know where we stand on that. So the next step, and I would highly recommend that you use your phone, right? And before you attempt to answer the question, take a picture, right? Or screen capture, whatever you want to do. You could do a screen capture on your computer, whatever you want to do, of the actual question, especially the ones that have multiple, that multiple select, because it's really easy to then go, you'll see in a moment, and then forget what all your possible choices are. So, take a screen capture, use your phone to take a picture of the question, whatever, so that you have a clear understanding of what the possible answers are, right? So let's go ahead now. So our choices are: indentured women received a dowry in exchange for their work. Female indentured servants typically worked as domestic servants. About 1/4 of the indentured servants in the Chesapeake were women. Female indentured servants were expected to marry when their term of service ended, and indentured women's future prospects were worse than men. So that, there's a lot there. So we're going to go to read about the concept, right? All right, and here we go. So it's only going to be this, forget about this area, because we're going to go directly to where it says indentured servitude. All right, so the system of temporary or indentured servitude developed out of practices in England. Most indentured servants were young men, blah, 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 blah. So we can skip right through that, right? Because it's only talking about the men. We want to get to the part about the women, okay? And that's down here. You see, most women, that's where we want to go, okay? Most women indentures, who constituted roughly 1/4 There we go. That's one of the possible answers. Remember, 1/4 of the total in the Chesapeake worked as domestic servants. Now you got two possible answers right there, right? One quarter and domestic servants, and were expected to marry when their term of servitude expired, right? And right, that's about it. That's about it. Let me see if there's anything else here, just in case, right? No. Okay, so we got 1/4 were women, right? Where are we? 1/4 were women. Worked as domestic servants and were expected to marry. Okay, so 2 questions, right? Female domestic servants is one of them. 1/4, one of them. Expected to marry, bingo, right? So let's check it. So you click medium. Don't worry about, I really don't think it makes a difference what you click, honestly. That's really for my purposes, because I get a report and I can see, if students are overconfident, underconfident, or I really don't think it's going to affect you. So let's go ahead and click medium. And there we go. Boom. Done. Right? ... Cool. Number 1, done. Next question. Okay, this is just multiple choice, so there's only one correct answer. The flow of immigrants from England to the American colonies declined in the early 18th century because of. Now, I don't remember, hearing anything about it, so I'm just going to continue playing this. I don't remember hearing why it would have declined. So let's go ahead and continue playing.
Who worked their own land, they were the backbone of colonial society.
So they were striving for that classic ideal of self-sufficiency.
Exactly. But life for women in particular was very different from what we might imagine.
Force behind the slave trade.
Okay, I don't think there's going to be anything else in here about, the decline in the immigration to the American colonies. So what are our choices, right? So the flow of immigrants from England to the American colonies declined in the early 18th century because of blank, right? Because of the increased English interest in other destinations, colonial restrictions against immigration from England, improvement in the economy in England, a declining standard of living in England. Again, best thing to do, take a screenshot so you remember what your choices are. Okay, read about the or even write them down, but it's easier to take a screenshot. Read about the concept. Okay, so now we already know that it's not here, right? Because it doesn't say anything. We already read this, so we know that it's not here. So it's probably up here. After uncertain beginnings, the non-indigenous population of English North America grew rapidly and substantially through immigration, importation of enslaved Africans, and natural population increase. By the late 17th century, Europeans and Africans outnumbered Native Americans along the Atlantic coast. Okay, so the answer is not there. A few of the early settlers were members of the English upper class, but most were English laborers. Some came independently, such as the religious dissenters in the early New England, but in the Chesapeake, at least these 3/4 of the immigrants in the 17th century arrived as indentured servants. So we know the answer is not there, okay? The system of temporary or indentured servitude developed out of practices of England. Most indentured servants were young men who bound themselves to masters. We're looking at the decline in immigration, right? Fixed terms of servitude, usually 4 or 5 years. Okay, it says nothing. It says nothing here about that, right? I'm just scanning very quickly through it. Okay, and this is the part about women. So we know it's not there. So we just move on to the next area in yellow. Okay. Shortly after the arrival of enslaved Africans, planters began to view them as critical to their economic successes. More importantly, they saw the great benefit in having a permanent population without the hope of freedom, consigned to a life of work and servitude. Okay, here we go. Accelerating efforts to import more slaves was a series of demographic changes. Beginning in the 1670s, a decrease. Look, beginning in the 1670s. So the key word to look for is decrease. Right? A decrease in the birth rate in England and an improvement in the economy. right? Decreased birth rate in England, improvement in the economy, reduced the pressures on laboring men and women to emigrate, right? As a result, the flow of indentured servants to North America slowly declined, right? So that's the reason. So it's giving you two possible reasons: a decrease in the birth rate in England and an improvement in the economy in England. So now you go back to questions, right? The flow of immigrants from England to the American colonies declined in the 18th century because of increased English interest in other destinations, colonial restrictions against immigration from England, improvement in the economy in England, a declining standard of living in England. Well, there were only two things, right? There were only two things in there. One of them was the improvement of the economy in England. The other one was an increase in the birth rate. So we're going to just put this one, an improvement in the economy in England. Medium, cool. It's correct. That is the correct answer. So on to the next question. Next question is just true or false. So you got a 50-50 chance. Immigration remained the main source of population growth in New England until the American Revolution. So let's go. Now here it didn't say anything, so let's go to read about the concept. So immigration remained the main source of population growth in New England until the American Revolution. All right. So, right here where it says birth and death, immigration remained for a time the greatest source of population growth in the colonies, but the most important long-range factor in the increase of the colonial population was its ability to reproduce itself. Okay? So again, it says here, immigration remained for a time the great... Now, notice that it said until the American Revolution. Here it doesn't say anything about that. So let's read all of it, right? Okay. Immigration remained for a time the greatest source of population growth in the colonies, but the most important long-range factor in the increase of the colonial population was its ability to reproduce itself. Improvement in the reproduction rate began in New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies, where natural increase was the New England population more than quadrupled through reproduction alone in the second half of the 17th century. This rise was not only of families having large numbers of children, it was also because of life expectancy. So here, what you got to pay attention is where it says immigration remained for a time, but it doesn't say until the American Revolution. For a time, which of course the American Revolution happens in the mid-18th century, right? For a time, greatest source of population. So we're going to go back to the question, and is immigration remained the main source of population growth in New England until the American Revolution? Well, that's not actually true, is it? Because it said for a time, but then it starts talking about reproduction being the thing. So I'm going to put false, right? And that is correct. You see, reason, after 1650, natural increase was the most important one. You see how it's a little bit tricky? Okay? So you got to really pay attention to the question, because the what threw it off, it's easy to say, oh yeah, there it is, immigration, but it said for a time. It never said through the American Revolution, which would have been in the mid-1700s. So that's why it is false. Got it? Okay. Next question. Multiple choice again. Unaware of blank, colonial communities were plagued with diseases that were transmitted through garbage or unclean water. Well, remember that if we watched the podcast back here, let's go back to the part about disease. Remember there's a part here about disease. There we go. So let's look at the part about disease again very quickly. There we go. So let's review that, right? So you're unaware of blank. Colonial communities were plagued with diseases that were transmitted through garbage or unclean water. Your choices are humorism, right? Heredity, physiology, and bacteria. Okay, this one is probably relatively easy to answer without even going back to look at it, but nonetheless, right? So let's go ahead and do this.
We sometimes have about the past.
It does. Now, speaking of challenges, let's imagine ourselves back in colonial America for a second. We're living in this world, we're going about our daily lives, and suddenly we get sick. What happens next?
Well, let's just say you're probably not calling 911.
I'm guessing not. No ambulance is rushing to your aid.
No, and forget about antibiotics or painkillers. The medical knowledge back then was, well, let's just say it was a bit different.
Different how? Give us an example.
Okay, imagine your doctor believes that your illness is caused by an imbalance of fluids in your body.
Fluids, like dot blood.
Exactly. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Those were the four humor.
The four humors. Okay, I've heard of that. But what
Okay, it's referring to humorism, right?
did they do about it?
Well, they tried to restore balance. So if you had too much blood, they might bleed you.
Bleed you, like with leeches.
Possibly. Or they might give you something to make you vomit or purge your bowel.
Okay, so again, unaware of. The key word is unaware of, right? So they believe that this humoralism is what causes disease. So that's certainly not the answer. It doesn't say anything about heredity. It doesn't say anything about physiology. It doesn't say anything about bacteria. But let's read about the concept. Okay, it's short. Death rates were very high for any person living in the colonial area. They reflected the state of medicine at the time, unaware of bacteria. Bingo. We don't even have to go any further, right? Go back to the questions. Unaware of bacteria, medium, boom. We got that one. Right? Which statements describe an effect of the failed promises of the indentured labor system in the Chesapeake? Remember, more than one possible answer. A large movement for reform that emerged in the colonies in 1675. A large rootless population of young single men became a source of social unrest. Colonial life was characterized by a pattern of families moving from place to place. Successful former laborers jealously guarded their jobs and lands, and many former servants found themselves without land, jobs, or prospects after their period of servitude ended, without land or whatever. Okay, so let's go over here. Okay, and obviously it's not here. You're just scanning through this, so it's not there. So we know. Look, there it is. Even though it's not highlighted. What I'm trying to say is, if you don't spot the answer like clearly, look above and below it. Even if it's not highlighted, because maybe it's in there, okay, right? And there it is, right? So by the late 17th century, the indentured servant population had become one of the largest elements of the colonial population and was creating serious social problems. There, right? Some former indentures managed to establish themselves successfully as farmers, tradespeople, or artisans, and some of the women married propertied men, but many found themselves without land, employment, families, and prospects for a better life. As a result, there emerged in some areas, particularly in the Chesapeake, a large floating population of predominantly young single men who were a source of social unrest. There it is, social unrest, prompting elites to consider enslaved Okay, there we go. So we go to the question. So it said nothing about a reform movement, right? It did say a large rootless population of young single men. Bingo. Colonial life was, okay, it said nothing about patterns of family life. Okay, successful former laborers jealously guarded their jobs and lands. I don't recall it saying anything of that. Okay, but certainly it said many former servants found themselves without land, jobs, or prospects. That it certainly said. So let's see. And there it is. So you see what I did here, Michelle? I could, at first it's like, I don't see anything about social unrest there. It was above it. Okay? I'm saying, just if you don't immediately, I'm looking at this and it didn't say anything about social unrest. It didn't say anything about social unrest up here either. But, right, I'm looking for keywords that trigger, and I saw social unrest. There we go. Let's read it. Okay, so let's go back to questions. So far, so good. Next question. Multiple choice, so only one correct answer. Upon a husband's death, wives in the colonies. Okay, so now we know that this specifically is a question having to do with women, right? And the family, right? And I remember, right, that there's a whole section here, oops, about the family, right? Here we go. So let's just, before doing anything else, the question is, upon a husband's death, wives in the colonies, what happened to wives in the colonies if their husbands die? So before anything else, let's go over here, right? And
Right. The reliance on enslaved Africans as a source of...
That's why I'm saying that before doing anything else, it's probably smart. The smartest thing to do is to sit down and watch the whole podcast. At least, because if nothing else, it'll at least remind you what part within that podcast
is a stain on our nation's
Okay.
history.
It is, and it's a subject we need to
All right,
explore in more depth. But for now, let's shift our focus to family life in colonial America. What was the typical family structure back then?
Well, most families were what we call freeholders.
Freeholders.
Yeah, these were small landowners who worked their own land. They were the backbone of colonial society.
So they were striving for that classic ideal of self-sufficiency.
Exactly. But life for women in particular was very different from what we might imagine today.
Okay, different how?
Well, they were expected to be completely subservient to their husbands and fathers. They had very limited legal rights and were seen primarily as helpmates, responsible for taking care of the household and raising children.
So not exactly a life of equality and empowerment?
Not at all. And their workload was immense. Imagine tending gardens, spinning wool, making clothes, churning butter, cooking, cleaning. The list goes on and on.
Wow, it sounds exhausting. And they were often having large families, right? Yes, 6 or 7 children wasn't unusual.
So far, nothing.
Hard to fathom the amount of work and responsibility they carried. But speaking of difficult realities, we need to address the elephant in the room, the Atlantic slave trade.
You're right.
So we know at this point that this section of the podcast, I mean, I can't cover everything in the podcast, you understand? So we know that the answer is not there. All right, next step, because sometimes it is. And if the answer is there, it's like, boom, right? But in this case, it's not. So upon a husband's death, wives in the colonies blank. And your options are could inherit and hold property, had to buy property from their husband's estate, had to give property to their closest male relative, were not allowed to inherit their husband's property. Okay? Read about the concept. Okay? Here we go. While women lived under the principle of coverture, which meant that they had their legal rights assumed by their husbands upon marriage. So we're looking at what happens if the husband dies. That's what we're looking at, right? Whereas an adult unmarried woman could own property and enter into contracts on her own, though often under the care of her father. Once she married, she lost those legal rights. Aha! Widows had a considerable amount of power because in most colonies they could inherit and hold property following their husband's death. Bingo! It's right there, right? Could inherit and hold property, right? Correct, right? And that's what we're doing. We're just going to be glancing very quickly to see where the answer is. All right, next question. Multiple select. By the way, I hate these. But anyways, I don't do it on purpose. It does it automatically. Okay, I don't have a choice. Select all that apply. So this is about, though it continued well into the 18th century, use of indentured labor in the colonies began to decline in the 1670s because of which factors? Well, we've already been asked this question before, haven't we? Sort of. Okay, it's about the reason why indentured servitude began to decline in the 1670s. Okay, again, it's the same. We already saw a question like this: a decrease in the English birth rate, English employers lobbying the king to put a stop to it. I can tell you, I didn't see jack shit about that. An increase in English prosperity, in other words, that the economy is doing better. New standards of limiting the use of indentured labor, and I didn't see any of that. Okay, so right away, because I have already, seen a very similar question, I'm looking at this, which is another way of saying an improvement in the English economy. But let's see if I'm right. I'm not going to answer it. Let's see if I'm right. Okay. I'm just skimming. Okay, we know it's not there. Servitude. And remember, it said in the 1670s. So I'm looking for something that says something about the 1670s and the decrease in indentured servitude. And it doesn't say anything there, right? I'm making sure it doesn't say anything there. So I'm just going to continue on down, keep scrolling on. Remember, it could be further down, right? It could be further down. By the late 17th century, the indentured servitude had one of the largest elements in the colonial era. Some of the former, okay, we know about this, right? So we just answered this one. We know that's not it. There we go. Shortly after the arrival of enslaved Africans, planters began to view them as critical to. Most importantly, they saw great benefit in having a permanent population. Here, 1670. Look. So you see what I'm doing? I'm looking for something that says 1670s. Beginning in the 1670s, a decrease in the birth rate in England and in the improved economy. Those two factors reduce the pressures on laboring men. Whatever. So it's two factors. Decreased birth rate, improved economy, right? Two questions. A decrease, there we go. And there we go. Let's see. Bingo. Okay, next question. The ratio of men to women in 17th century America affect colonial women's lives. Colonial women often could not find husbands. Colonial women lives were consumed by childbearing. Remember, there's going to be more men than women, right? So this one can't be it because there's going to be more men than women, right? Colonial women's lives were consumed by childbearing. Remember that they had, we're looking at it here, right? 6 or 7 children. Colonial women rarely remained unmarried. Colonial women were infrequently widowed. Okay, so we're going to go and read about the concept. So how did the ratio of men and women affect their lives? There we go. Look at the second paragraph. Because there were many more men than women. So I didn't even read this up here. I saw this and I go, oh, there's where it is. That's where it's going to discuss the ratio between men and women. Because there were many more men than women in 17th century America, few women remained unmarried for long. So there were plenty of men to choose from, and women were getting married by the truckload, if there were such thing as trucks back then. The average white European woman in America married for the first time at 20 or 21 years of age because of the large number of indentured servants who were forbidden to marry until their terms of service expired, and because female indentured servants frequently had their terms of service extended. Premarital sexual relationships were not uncommon. Children born out of wedlock to indentured white women were often taken from their mothers at a young age and bound as indentured servants. I'm going to continue reading just in case there's something else there, right? White women in the Chesapeake could anticipate a life consumed with childbearing. That's another one of the possibilities, right? The average wife experienced pregnancies every 2 years. Holy shit. Those who lived long enough bore an average of 8 children apiece, up to 5 of whom typically died in infancy and early childhood, since childbirth was one of the most frequent causes of female death. Many women did not survive to see their children grow to maturity. Those who did, however, were often widowed, since they were usually much younger than their husbands. So here we go. Okay, we know it's not this. There were plenty of men to go around. Oh, we do know that colonial women's lives were consumed by childbearing, all right? Every 2 years, they're popping out another baby. Colonial women rarely remained unmarried. It did say that because there's plenty of men to go around. Now, it says colonial women were infrequently widowed. Infrequent, not frequently, but it said the opposite, right? So here we go. Correct. Both of them. Okay. Again, it's a matter of being clear what the possible answers are and then looking for words, keywords that give you an indication as to where the answer may be. Next one. Which factors explain why New England experienced a high rate of natural population increase in the 1600s? Okay. Which factors explain why New England experienced a high rate of natural population increase? In other words, it's not immigrants or anything like that. Exceptional longevity, large numbers of new arrivals. Okay. Well, we know it's not. We know it's not this because it's natural population increase. So we know it's not large numbers of new arrivals because that's not natural. Late marriages. Well, we just read where women were getting married around the age of 20 or 21. Okay. Extremely high birth rates. We know that's one of them. We know because they're popping out 8 or 9 babies, right? So we know that's one of them, but we don't want to like take a wild guess. Let's go ahead and with how you read about this concept. Again, immigration remained for a time the greatest source of population growth in the colonies, but the most important, hold on. I'm looking for longevity. You know, people living longer is what I'm looking for. So, okay, so we know it's not there. Improvement in the reproduction rate began in New England and mid-Atlantic colonies were natural. There we go. Look, you see how I'm looking for keywords? It wanted to know about natural increase in population. And that natural increase was the most important source of population growth of after the 1650s. The New England population more than quadrupled through reproduction alone in the second half of the 17th century. This rise was a result not only of families having large numbers of children, it was also because life expectancy in New England was unusually high. Bingo, bingo, bingo. Exceptional longevity, extremely high birth rates. Right? Let's see. Boom. Okay. Next question. Okay, thank God, a multiple choice. Enslaved people first became generally available in North America when commerce in enslaved Africans developed between southern colonies and the Caribbean. Slavery was outlawed in the Caribbean, and slave traders switched focus to North American mainland. Some planters organized raids on the African coast. The majority of enslaved people were sent directly from Africa to the North American mainland. So those are our choices. So I'm going to go back over here, right? And, right? So we know it's not this time period. We know it's not 1502 to 1580. We know that it is after 1580 because, you know, obviously, right? The first colonies, British colonies, were in 1621. So we know it's after 1580. After 1580, most slaves went to the Caribbean and Brazil to work the sugar plantations. More than half the slave trade took place during the 18th century with the British, Portuguese, and French, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's giving us an idea. Enslaved people first became generally available in North America when, okay, so we're going to go to read about the concept. The demand for enslaved Africans to supplement the indenture to free force existed almost from the first moments of settlement. For a time, however, enslaved workers were hard to find. Not until the mid-17th century, when a substantial commerce in enslaved labor grew up between the Caribbean islands and the southern colonies, did enslaved Americans become more generally available. You see that? That's where it is, right? It's saying when a substantial commerce in enslaved labor grew up between Caribbean islands and the southern colonies, did enslaved Africans become more generally available? Okay, so back to the question. Okay, commerce in enslaved islands, they were right up between southern, there it is, right there. There it is, right there, right? Remember, this is multiple choice. There's only one answer, right? Boom. Correct, right? Next question. The term triangular trade is inaccurate because the so-called triangle had more than 3 points. True or false? Now, I happen to know this, but the term triangular trade refers to the Atlantic slave trade. All right, so let's go here. Where was it? You're going to see that it's a triangle, right? Look, you see the triangle, right? Now, it doesn't say anything about that here, okay? And I know I don't have anything in my slides, you know, but it doesn't say anything about that here. So we're just going to go directly, and this is true or false. We're going to go directly to the concept, read about the concept. So the question is, the term triangular trade is inaccurate because there were more than 3 points. So let's see. Let's see where it is. We're looking for the word triangular. Keyword, triangular. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, it doesn't say shit about triangular there. So it could be that it's above here, because I don't see any of that here, right? I don't see it here. I'm looking for the word triangular. Okay, now let's see if this works. Aha, look. I put in the word, I did the search and put in the word triangular. Did you see what I did? No? Look, I'll do it again. I went up here. You see the little search thing up here? I clicked on that and I put the word triangular. Oh, there we go. I got a couple hits. Okay, so it says this commerce has often been described somewhat inaccurately. Look, inaccurately. Click. There was also trade with England, continental Europe, and the west coast of Africa. This commerce has often been described somewhat inaccurately as the triangular trade, suggesting a neat and orderly process by which merchants carried rum and other goods from New England to Africa, exchanged for their merchandise and slave workers, whom they then transported to the West Century, right? And then it says, in reality, the so-called triangular trade in rum and slave labor and sugar was a complicated maze of highly diverse trade routes. But did you see what I did? That I put a keyword up here? Boom. Okay. The term triangular trade is inaccurate because the so-called triangular have more than 3 points. That is true. Boom. So learn to use the little thing here. Okay. Multiple select. South Carolina and Georgia became dependent on the labor of enslaved Africans, for which two of the following reasons. Okay, South Carolina and Georgia. Okay, so let's do something interesting here. I know I have something about that here. Right? It says South Carolina and Georgia, large plantation owners became the gentry. Okay, your possible answers are many Africans were expert in rice cultivation and harvesting. Okay, once two, remember that. It wants two. White workers increasingly refused to serve as domestic laborers. There was a large demand for the labor of enslaved Africans on tobacco plantations. Tobacco was becoming increasingly popular in Europe. White workers refused to perform rice cultivation. Okay, so developed distinct Gallo mix, whatever. Right. Okay, so we're gonna keep going here. It doesn't say anything about that, and here certainly doesn't say anything about any of that, right? And then beyond this, there's nothing else that has to do with slaves. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna South Carolina and Georgia, dependent on the labor for two reasons. So we're going to go to read about the concept. Let's see if this will work. Look at that. You see what happened there? I put in the words South Carolina and Georgia because the question has to do with both of those colonies. So, look at one of them. South Carolina and Georgia relied on rice production. That was one of them since the low-lying coastline, and then it goes on. But let's click on this. Right. So it says, here's Virginia. Okay, we don't care about that. This is Virginia. Oop, South Carolina and Georgia relied on rice production since the low-lying coastline with its many tidal rivers made it possible to create rice paddies that could be flooded and drained. Rice cultivation was so difficult and unhealthy that many white workers simply refused to perform it. Right? That was one of your answers. Let's go to the question. South Carolina and Georgia became dependent on the labor of the slaves because, okay, many Africans were experts in rice cultivation. White workers increasingly refused to service. Okay, we know it's got nothing to do with that. There were large demand for the labor. Okay, we know it's got nothing to do with tobacco. Tobacco, we know it's got nothing to do with tobacco. We eliminated these three. Boom and boom, right? White workers refused to perform rice cultivation. Learn to use the little thing, search. Okay, again, the society that formed in colonial America was completely devoid of social distinctions. The society, true or false, the society that formed in colonial America was completely devoid of social distinction. You know what we're going to do? Pay attention. Social distinctions. Although there were sharp social distinctions in the colonies, the well-defined and deeply entrenched class system of England failed to reproduce itself in America. Okay? To question. The society that formed in colonial America was completely devoid of social distinction. It didn't say that. It said there were some, but not to the extent as they were in Europe. So we're going to put false. One more. The Iron Act of 1750 is an example of, okay? You know what? What phrase, what keyword would you use? The Iron Act, right? Very simple. The Iron Act. So let's go. Your choices are the Iron Act of 1750 is an example of efforts to compel Americans to sell their wares domestically, royal edicts designed to direct industrial activity, English Parliament regulations that restricted American industrial growth, English efforts to foster industry and trade in the American colonies. So that's Iron Act, right? Copy. Actually, I'm just gonna do the whole thing. Iron Act of 1750. Control C. Read about the thing. Search. The Iron Act of 1750 restricted metal processing in the colonies, right? Similar prohibitions limited the manufacture of woolens, hats, and other goods. But the biggest obstacles to industrialization in America were an inadequate labor supply, a small domestic market, and poor transportation. So, but this isn't giving me everything. I'm just going to go a little bit above it here and say, these and other growing industries did not immediately become the basis for the kind of explosive industrial growth that Great Britain experienced in the late 18th century, in part because English parliamentary regulations, such as the Iron Act of 1850, restricted metal processing in the colonies. Okay? The Iron Act of 1750 is an example of, right? So it's got nothing to do with how the colonists sell their wares. Royal edicts, right? But it didn't say, it said parliament. I know, you got to pay attention. It said parliament, not the king, right? English parliamentary, here we go, English parliamentary regulations that restricted American industrial growth, right? Right there.